we need to feel a part of something. Kids need to be known, one, and they also need to feel a connection to a group. We have so many thoughts every single day, and most of those thoughts are repetitive and most of those thoughts are negative. Like, what if we based our masculinity around things that are like in our hearts, in our head, in our character, right? It's something that we used to think you stuff it down, you don't share your feelings.
Yeah, men never do that. There are a lot of men out there, Dennis, I'm sure you know, that are struggling with suicide and alcohol. It's something that's very alarming, and I know the work that you're doing is so important to reduce that rate. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Live Your Truth Now podcast. I'm Mike Ligori, and joining me today is a man that I admire quite much, not just for the work that he's doing, but also just an outstanding all-American man. Dennis Morolda, welcome to the show, my friend.
What's up, Mike? Good to be here, dude. I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course, man. You're doing some important work. And, today for all of you that are listening, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. There are a lot of people out there who are very passionate about this work. And Dennis is one of those people. And he's also one of those men who talks the talk and walks the walk. And Dennis from Building Men, I'm going to give you an opportunity, Dennis, to share with everybody what you're doing. But before we dive into that, we started off this kind of recording talking about our dear friend Akshay Nanavati and from Firvana, and Akshay was on the podcast earlier. I encourage you guys to go check out that episode. Akshay, I think in his book really, really did frame it in such a beautiful way, Dennis, of talking about you are the thinker of your thoughts, you are the feeler of your feelings, and you are the experiencer of your experiences. And you said you were using that with the young men that you're working with. Tell me about that work that you're doing when you frame it in that manner. What's the reaction for these young men when they hear something like that or they see something like that from you?
The boys that I'm working with, it's in a couple different ways right now. I work with boys individually, in groups virtually. And then I'm also in schools and I'm working with groups of boys in a specific middle school or high school. One of the coolest things is that I've recognized is that one, we need to feel a part of something, right? Kids need to be known, one, and they also need to feel a connection to a group. It could be a sports team, it could be a club, an organization, Boy Scouts, whatever it is. And if they don't find that level of camaraderie and brotherhood, they'll often look to negative, connections. That's why we see kids join gangs. That's why they're so popular. They feel a connection to something. So what I attempt to do is create a space where kids can get together and talk about the real stuff. I was a teacher. I was a principal for many years, and I ran a boys' social group as a principal. And I recognized so many things that we're doing in school we could potentially be doing better. And a lot of the real stuff that we need to learn as kids going through, and things that I wish I could go back and relearn in school, we're not teaching those things. And so what I decided to do was, what are things that boys need to learn? And then how can I help them learn these things in a safe space with other adult males there leading them through? When you think about rites of passages for boys, one of the big things is they need to see men doing things and being that guide or that mentor. And it's something that I didn't have growing up, right? I had a father, but I didn't. It was more of an abusive relationship that I had with my father. So I was constantly trying to figure out what did it mean to be a man. He coached my sports team, so he was there physically, but I didn't have that guy that I could, get an idea. And I developed
that emotional relationship. Yep. Yeah.
So I developed some ideals around what it meant to be a man. And it was around you had to be the best athlete. You had to be with the most girls. You had to make the most money. And that's what I thought. I was attached to that as I was growing up, but I always knew that wasn't right. I just didn't know what it was. So it was I would look to guys I think about the movie Dead Poet Society, Professor Keating. And it was he was a guy I wish I could have a conversation with that guy. Even Robin Williams is in Good Will Hunting. I wish I could talk to that guy. Or there were sports guys Professor or Coach Boone from Remember the Titans. He showed you that tough love a little bit. So I was trying to pick out these guys in the world that I would think this was what it meant to be a man. I was always searching for it. So I thought about one day, if I had an opportunity to help young men, I would help them figure out what it meant to be a man. But first I had to become that guy. When I'm with boys in a school, one cool thing, and I know we got the whole thing got interrupted, but to wrap it around to your question about like, how do the boys react to it? I think them seeing having an opportunity to feel connection to something or feel connected to a group, a space, and to see a guy. And when I'm in a school, there's also like a guidance counselor, an assistant principal, a teacher that's there along with me, and to see guys have conversations about real things and share their level of vulnerability, going through different situations. For the boys to see that it's okay to say, you know what, I was really scared when I was growing up. I was really anxious, and I share a story. I remember being in 8th grade, and all my other friends hit puberty, and I knew it because they had armpit hair, right? I remember thinking like, I don't have armpit hair right now, so I don't want to go to a pool party and take off my shirt because I'm really nervous about that. And what are the girls going to think if they see me and
armpit hair?
Right. And so I remember feeling like that.
I remember.
And so when I talk to 8th grade boys about that, all of a sudden I see them like looking around like, oh, wait, I'm not the only one who feels like that. There's this dude who's now, I'm 6'4", 220. I'm a big guy, and I'm like in front of the room, but he felt insecure and vulnerable about something. And that's just one small example. So when I talk about that to the boys, I see them connecting in a way like, guys go through stuff like this, and I feel like this, and there's other guys that are going through something similar. And then when I talk about our mindset, which is such a big part of it, which is, wrapping it back to the initial point of the question, like when we talk about you are not your thoughts, I dive deep into that. We have so many thoughts every single day, and most of those thoughts are repetitive, and most of those thoughts are negative. And I use the phrase, I talk to the boys, I ask them, have you ever heard of the phrase abracadabra? And the boys are like, yeah. And I'm like, well, what do you think about them? Immediately. And they say, magic, right? Abracadabra, magic. And then I hit him with, okay, one of the literal translations of abracadabra is from the language, it's ancient Aramaic, and abracadabra literally translates to with my words I create. And so when you talk about you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, you're like, what are the words you use when you speak to yourself then? So let's dive deep into that, because most of the time we're using negative self-talk, and how can we adjust that a little bit? So we do some really practical things as well. But my reaction, initially the boys don't want to be there. What happens is they're like, oh, why do we have to be here? But then once they're like, oh, wow, we're talking about real stuff. So now I'll be in a high school this week, and one of the topics of conversation will be cheap dopamine hits. And let's talk about that. Let's like normalize. And so we'll talk about them not only like, utilizing technology in a negative way, but like we'll talk about pornography, and I'll share stories of, my experience, not like graphic stories, but like, hey, listen, I struggled with it when I was, at different points in my life. And so then you see the boys looking around like, oh, wait a second. It's okay to say like, yeah, I look at porn way too much and I don't like it and I want to stop doing it. Which is a really powerful thing. It's not the norm for 16-year-old kids to get in a space to talk about that stuff.
Yeah. And also, I think a lot of, that I think this is just a great way to open up the conversation is that there's a lot of pressure for men. And this is not to discredit that women don't feel pressure at all. The pressure with men, though, has been something that is very unique and specific since the dawn of time, where fathers set this expectation of this is what it means for you to be a man, and you need to act a certain way. And, in your experience, what you were saying is, I had to sleep with a lot of women. I had to excel at sports. I had to, be the biggest and baddest. I had to go fight the biggest dude in the bar room to show how tough I was. And again, this is gender specific. In my opinion, gender specific type of pressure. Young boys feel that from a very young age because they're so impressionable. I mean, all kids are, but I would assume in your experiences, these young boys that are hearing from their dads or they're watching men that they think they should emulate, the transition to emulate those types of men happens so fast and so quickly. It must create such a detriment to their own self-confidence, because if they don't meet that, what happens? What happens to these young boys that go, I can't be, at least when I was growing up, and this is just kind of to date me a little bit, like I always thought Arnold Schwarzenegger was the coolest.
The man.
Yeah, I thought he was the coolest. I was like, even in Kindergarten Cop, I thought he was like, I thought he was great.
I thought so many great lines in that movie too. Oh my God. So many great lines.
I know. And like the fact is like, to me, it's, I just got done reading his book, Be Useful, which is an amazing book. Guy was governor twice of the 6th largest economy in the world. He was 8-time Mr. Olympia. He was the highest grossing actor, and he was huge, and he had he has the accent, and he was just the epitome of what I thought was being a man back then, and him and Ric Flair.
By the way, Ric Flair was on the game last night. I whenever this comes out, Eagles, and I watched. I YouTubed. I was talking to everybody in the area about Ric Flair, and there's a YouTube video with every single woo he ever did in his whole career. It's like a 4-minute video. It's amazing. Sorry, I jumped.
No. But I thought that's what it was. It was like it thought it was like machismo and all of these things. Anyway, I say all that because I sense that in your work with young boys and, going through that process myself in my life, the pressure must be just so daunting now with social media also reinforcing the amplification of these messages and what it means to be a man. How do you navigate those conversations? Is there anything specific that comes up with this generation? I don't know. Is it Generation Z? What generation are we on with these boys?
When I'm working with boys, first I like to ask them about technology, right? And they're all walking in with their phones, right? And that's depending on the school. Like most schools allow the kids to have phones in some capacity. But what I do is I ask them, what do you think your average screen time is? Let's just put it out there. What's your guess on your average screen time? And usually their guesses are, and I've done this in many schools, it's like 3 hours, 3.5 hours is their guess. And so I chart down, let's take the average of what we think it is. And then all right, what is it really? And on average, what's happening is it's about 7 hours a day that they're on their phones for. With the high that I've seen, 14 hours on average, a kid was on his phone over the course. And he said, well, I listen to music or whatever. Okay, that's fine. But even that's 7 hours is a lot. We start to talk about it. I'm not trying to shame them, but I'm just let's look at the reality right now. And is this something that do you feel is serving you? And then we talk about, okay, before you go onto your phone, do you feel like there's a need for it? If I said, put your phone down and all your notifications pop up on your phone and you see that, how long do you think it would take you until you feel like you have to grab the phone? They start to recognize, well, it depends what the notifications are. I'm like, no, any notification pops up, they would be like, I'd have to do it right away. And so then we start to talk about our brain and how it works. And it has become something that is as addictive as heroin. And once the kids start to understand that it's a space where they cannot perform without this thing, that they have a reliance on it, I start to talk to them about okay, how do you want to have a relationship with your phone and with technology? And phones have become, they basically killed television, they've killed books, they've killed, calendars, they've killed cameras, everything. We do use our phones for maps, navigation systems across the board, radios. Then I ask him to really have the honest conversation. Is the technology serving you? i.e. an alarm clock. I want to get up at 6 o'clock. I'll set my alarm on my phone. So now it is doing something that I wanted to do. If I want to learn something, I want to learn, who was the co-star with Arnold Schwarzenegger in, Terminator 2. I want to learn that. So I'm going to look it up, the technology serving me, or am I serving the technology? If I go onto TikTok and I'm just there scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, now I am a slave to this technology. And when I put it in that way, when you could ask boys to be really cognizant of what is the intention behind it? Is it serving you or you serving it? It's something at least to get the conversation started. And I ask them I challenge themselves to cut down their technology uses by 10% over the course of X number of weeks. So I'll be back in a school tomorrow, for example, and I had the boys set that intention that they're going to cut down 10%. And they all wrote it down, how often they were using their phone on a weekly average. They wrote it down. They made the promise to themselves, and we're going to come back. And this is after winter break. So they've had a month. And we're going to see how we did with this. If they were successful, what strategies did they use? And if they were not successful, can they learn from some of the boys in the group who were successful? That's an example, how we can have a real conversation about technology. But I also showed them what my average screen time was. And while I do use it for business, I do find myself from time to time, I'll get on Instagram and all of a sudden a half hour passes and I'm like, what the hell did I just look at? I have no idea. I have no clue. All of a sudden I saw like a peregrine falcon like taking off the head of a duck, and I watched 3 times in a row, and I went down a rabbit hole of like, what the hell did I just look at for the last half hour? But also, again, for me to normalize that to the boys, I'm not sitting up on a soapbox saying, don't ever do this. I'm like, yeah, I know what you're going through. I just did the same exact thing myself. But at the end of it, I felt like, wow, I just spent a half hour doing this. What if I read a book that I learned something? Or what if I went to the gym? Or if I fill in the blank here, I did something creative for the world? Like, what was time better spent for me?
That's and so a really important exercise that you just posed to them. That's it. One thing I wanted to jump in here that I found really interesting is, as you were talking about technology and this amplification of messages that are coming from multiple different platforms. They're seeing something on TikTok. They're seeing something on Instagram. They're probably watching YouTube. As they're getting older, you remember being a teenage boy, you're curious. You're just wondering what things are. Do you find it's hard for them to define what it means to be a man?
100%. And my first meeting in a school with boys, what I do is we talk about, like, I share a story with them about my experience growing up. It's more of a tearjerker story about my relationship with my father and how, like, he tried to teach me about his ideals of what it meant to be a man, which I explained to you before. And so afterwards, I was struggling to find out what it meant. I asked the boys, like, build me a man. Like, what do you think it is? There's a lot of it is around, like, physical dominance, like the way you look, around like getting the girl, and a lot of it around making the money. They also will throw in, like, you got to be the protector, you got to be the provider. They'll use words like responsibility and self-discipline and things like that. But I think overarching, like, a lot of boys that are in like later middle school years and into high school, they're still idolizing that, like, rap star, NFL football player, you have the gold teeth and the chain and the sneakers and the girls around you at the press conference. That still is very, very attractive to them, which I understand. Like, if I'm, 16 years old and that's in my face, I'm like, oh man, I want that too. So when I could say that, like, I remember being in that space and wanting that too, but then you start to recognize, like, okay, what happens if this guy that's up on stage right now gets into, a terrible accident, and he can't use his legs anymore, and he can't catch the ball like he used to, and he's unable to perform sexually like he used to, or loses money? Is he no longer a man? If we're defining masculinity around these things, what happens if, like, what if we based our masculinity around things that are, like, in our hearts, in our head, in our character? Then those things can't be taken away. So what if it's around being accountable to other people? What is it about being authentic, right? What if it's about integrity, leadership, resilience? What if it's about self-discipline, or even service to other people? Those are things that no one can take away from us. Let's start to identify our perceptions of what it means to be a man around those types of things. And it's not an overnight process, but little challenges I put in there, in front of them over the course of a year, they start to figure it out. And the cool thing is they start to figure it out together. And when I did it, when I was a principal, Mike, I started the first Building Men group in October of 2005. So going all the way back to my first year as an administrator. And I did the same thing, and the boys had the same things. And the more we got together and talked about it, it's not an overnight thing, but in 1 year of being a part of the program, the suspension rate in the school dropped 75%. 75% in 1 year, because most of the suspensions were boys, most of the, the failing grades were boys, most of the, kids classified into special education were boys, because a lot of them were misunderstood and they didn't have a space to go and talk about the real stuff. So, okay, what if we do that? We can start to fill in the blanks and fill in the gaps of things that they're not getting at home, or that they're seeing in negative aspects. It wasn't really social media back then, but it is now.
Do you find that young boys are having a difficult time discerning what is real to them? Because I would imagine in the messaging that comes around masculinity with the rap star and the NFL star, I would imagine that there's a lot of difficulty around discerning if that's a reality for them, or that's something that they can truly aspire to, or that is their definition of being a man.
Yeah, there's that. And there's the Andrew Tates of the world have gotten a lot of fanfare with the boys right now, where they see this guy who's wearing the sunglasses, who's on the yacht driving the Ferraris. So it looks very attractive to them. Authenticity is one of the character pillars that I use with the boys. And like we talk about, are you like the things that you see are not necessarily what's actually going on. Like to be able to really look at things more critically, and it were there like lights, camera, action type of thing. It's like, is Thanos real? Like if we're watching the Avengers, like it's the same thing as like when we're seeing these things on social media. So to start to look at things a little bit more critically, and then also to help them be really honest with themselves about who they are, not who do they think other people think they are. It's like when you look at yourself in the mirror, like who is the person that you see, and then who is the person that you want to see in the mirror. So when we set goals for ourselves, it's not just around, well, I want to accomplish X, Y, and Z. What we do is we talk about, okay, who is the young man who accomplishes that goal? Like whatever that goal is, like talk about the young man, like what are the character traits that they have? If it's, I want to be able to bench for a boy in 8th grade, I want to be able to bench 135. Like that's a goal that I've set for myself. So whatever their goal is, okay, that's great. But what is a young man that benches 135? Tell me about him. Well, he's strong. Okay, well, what does that mean? Let's talk about strength. And is it easier to hit snooze, or is it easier to get up and, go to the gym in the morning? It's way easier to hit snooze. Okay, so the person who's doing it has to be resilient. They have to, choose a difficult or more challenging situation over the easier outcome. They need to be disciplined, right? So we start to talk about, like, if we're going to do those things, what type of person do I need to be able to do it? And then how can I get to that point? How can I close the gap there? And so when I talk to those boys, about the things, it's about being truly honest with like who you're seeing in the mirror and being okay with it. And then if you want to achieve something, more and better in the future, well, who is the person that's doing it and what can we do to get to that point?
I had a conversation with somebody earlier today, and we were talking about men in tribes and how there always needs to be a leader in a tribe. And to be a good leader, you have to be a follower first. You have to learn how to follow. And it's the same thing applies in terms of respect. In order to get respect from people, you have to learn how to give it first. There's been many articles that have been published about today's teenagers feel lonelier than ever. They don't feel like that there's a sense of connectivity and relationship building. And I would sense also that for these boys that are coming to you or they're working with you, there's a sense of loneliness. Like they feel like they don't have a community of men or boys to do this with, this type of work. Do you try to cultivate that sense of community and kind of reintegrate or reinstate the history or the lineage of how men have been able to really prosper and propel forward great achievements in life? If you think about the Greek Senate, right? They didn't just argue with themselves. They argued in groups and they debated in groups. Talk to me about community principles when it comes to men.
And I believe this does start at a very young age. Something that I really missed out on growing up was watching an adult male role model have those conversations with other men in front of boys, right? I think like we learn a lot by observing those things going on in our life, and the lessons are caught and not taught. Like I could talk until I'm blue in the face about whatever, but if I'm not embodying those things, not only for my own kids, but for young men that I'm working with, they have like this like bullshit button that they could be like, what? No way. There's that you might be saying that, but you're not living those things. Boys do need to feel a part of a tribe and a community. It's like, animalistic things for boys, like, Lord of the Flies. You get a group of boys together, take away technology and you put them out there. They're going to find a way to compete. They're going to find a way to, be physical and do those things. So boys do need those type of experiences and challenges. In a school, it's hard for me to set up like wrestling matches or things like that. But having conversations is a really powerful thing. And there will be leaders that will rise to the surface in different areas. But it also, what I've recognized, it depends on the topic of conversation. So I've had some kids really step up when we're talking about, say, for example, we'll talk about like respect. And I'll have a kid whose father's in the military and he'll step up and he'll have a lot to say about that, but maybe not so much in the area of curiosity, because in his family, he's basically told, sit down, shut up. And another family, a kid it's more cultivated in his experience to ask questions. And so when we talk about curiosity, let's have the conversation about it. So what I do is I set up opportunities for kids to talk, one, in small groups. So say tomorrow, one of the topics of conversation, I call it the 3 thieves. And those three thieves are resistance, distraction, and victimhood. And the topic of conversation is these are three things that will get in their way of success. Resistance, so not doing the hard things because it's hard. You don't want to, I don't want to get up early. I don't want to blah, blah, blah. I don't feel like studying right now because distraction is their phones, playing video games. It could be just sleeping or whatever. It could be pornography like we talked about. And victimhood. I can't do this because my parents, because the teacher, because the coach, because society, because I'm short, because whatever. And what we're going to do tomorrow is, okay, these are things that could potentially get in your way. How do we overcome these things? Like, what are some heroes that could potentially arise within us to be able to fight these things? So that'll be our topic of conversation. So kids will talk in small groups about it, and then they'll have to come up with a way to present out their point of view. And so each time that we do this, I have, it's either me working with them. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to have my son with me, who's a freshman in college, is going to come and help me lead groups of 8th grade boys. But then also some male teachers or counselors in the school, and they'll help facilitate the conversation, but the boys are leading it. And then they have to find a way to present their information out to the rest of the group and share something that we can learn from. And so it's a perfect opportunity to add in some things that, I wish I learned in school, like really the art of public speaking in a way that I'm not doing it just to go click through a PowerPoint. How do we present ourselves in a way where we're speaking in a public forum or a public setting? And so these are things that we're doing on a regular basis. And so now you have to be able to get kids, be able to, have this pitch and get people to get onto your side and explain to them why this is such an important piece of their developmental needs growing up. So that's just a quick example of how kids are coming together in this community feel. And it doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just happen because we're all following the same schedule. In my work with educators, even I tell them you need to be really, really intentional about building community. And how do you do that? You greet each other, you share experiences, you have fun, you go through activities together, and you have ceremonial things that you're doing that are more like rites of passages for kids to go through.
I love the concept of sovereignty. That's the first thing that comes to mind is that I think there's been a lack of that, especially with our the younger population, is this idea that to be a sovereign individual means total absolute freedom, is being able to make choices, make decisions, take responsibility and accountability for yourself and the people around you. Especially as a man, there is this notion that being a protector / provider that's been integrated and handed down for us for generations, and it will probably continue to do so long after we're gone. I do think, though, there has been a lack of that sovereignty, though, with technology. And you had mentioned, devices. And one of the things that comes up for me is AI, where this voice is talking back to them. This voice is giving them information. This voice is telling them what to think and what to feel. I would imagine that there is a sense of losing sovereignty over that when that happens. How do you reinstill or get these young men to get back on track when they do start sensing that, they are scrolling or they are finding themselves not sure to know the difference between truth and falsehood, or even when something is morally conflicted with them, if they find themselves in a bad situation, which does happen when people join gangs, when they're in those situations and they go, hey, Mr. Morolda or Dennis, I did something bad or morally did something that I didn't feel good about, but I did it anyway. How do they feel and explain the situations to you? I would imagine it is different. And I would also imagine that you specifically handle those conversations much differently in removing shame from that, which I think is such a big detriment towards being sovereign. How do you navigate those challenges?
Right. And it's such a powerful thing and a great question as well, Mike. And I think too, as I think about the idea of shame, and the difference again between guilt and shame, it's I did something wrong or I am something wrong. And when kids start to feel it, first thing I do is I will normalize, listen, one, thank you for sharing that with me. It took a lot of courage to get to the point where you're sharing something, and there's so much strength in allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Right. It's something that we used to think you stuff it down. You don't share your feelings.
Yeah. Men never do that.
Right. Exactly. And then also you're not the only one that's going through this.
Yeah.
You're not the only one. There are so many others of us have experienced the same thing. So when you recognize you're not isolated. So one, you're getting validated for sharing it and feeling like you're the only one that has ever felt like this. That's the big thing off the bat. I do my best to not lecture, and it's like helping them work through whatever it is, because if there's that love, there's that thing that's going on. So let's talk about what happened. Like, what was the antecedent to that? So what happened right before that? And is there anything that we could have potentially done differently? There's the thing, like, what's the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree? Well, it's right now.
Yeah.
Right. So like, okay, this happened. So let's talk about like what happened right before. Was there something you were trying to get met that you were unable to? Could you have done something a little bit differently? And say this happens again right now. How could we take a different path? So whatever happened, we're here now, and we could decide how we want to go moving forward. I'll often pull out little, poems or quotes or fables. And I love it's like the Cherokee Indian who's speaking to his grandson, and the grandson is like, teaching him he's teaching his grandson about these two wolves that exist within all men, say. And he says that there's this like terrible fight that's going on, and there's these two wolves that exist in all of us. And one of the wolves is like anger and envy and greed and arrogance and resentment, inferiority, that exists. And then there's this other wolf, and he's like good, and it's like love and humility, kindness and generosity, compassion. And there's this constant struggle that's going on inside of you. And the grandson looks at the grandfather and says, Grandpa, like, who wins this fight? And he goes, the one that you feed. And so to talk to boys about, listen, in all of us, there exists, there's like the shadow inside of all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
When this happens, like you see the thing pop up on the phone, and you could go down that negative path. You're going to be hanging out in a spot where you want to punch the dude in the face, or you want to, grab the beer and get behind the wheel. Like that exists in all of us. But also within us exists the guy that's going to be like, hey, that doesn't serve your goals for the future. Like doing that is going to hurt someone else. So where do we look? And if we look for something, we'll see it, right? I use the example with boys too. I'm like, all right, here's one thing that I said the last time I was there. I stood in front of the boys and I said, have any of you guys seen a red car in the last 24 hours? And they're like, sure. Yeah, I've seen a red car. I'm like, yeah, I'm driving around the street or whatever in the parking lot. You've seen a red car. And I said, exactly how many red cars have you seen in the last 24 hours? And they're like, I have no clue. I don't know how many red cars I've seen. Like, why would I know that? And I said to them, all right, in the next 24 hours, what if I told you I'll give you $100 for every single red car you see? Do you think you'll notice every red car? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, why? Why would you notice it? Like, well, there's an opportunity for me there. All right, well, what if we take that idea and make it in every single part of our life? What if we start to look for those opportunities, those good things? And in the two wolves, instead of saying we're a piece of shit and we're angry and we're whatever, what if we start to look for reasons why we're compassionate, reasons why we're kind and generous and empathetic? Will we see those things as well? Absolutely. We need to retrain our brain to start again, talking like back to Akshay, like abracadabra, with my words I create. That whole idea resonates with boys in that capacity as well.
We're coming up to the last segment of the show, and Dennis, again, I think this is just incredibly informative and so amazing, the work that you're doing with these young boys. So just thank you for just coming on here and sharing all the work that you're doing with building men. And I think for a lot of us, there may be not so much knowledge or awareness around what young boys are dealing with today when it comes into, transitioning from the young boy to a man. And with all of your experience and knowledge and just the work that you're doing, boots on the ground, so to speak, do you have hope for the future of masculinity? And if so, what comes to mind from a positive aspect?
I absolutely do. And it's the whole idea of, let me see if I could get this right. It's something along the lines of, hard times create good men. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. I think that's how it goes. Yeah. And what I do when I talk to the boys, I tell them, like, right now in the world, you're living in a hard time, especially for boys, because here's the thing, like one thing that we talk about initially, once the boys feel that they're comfortable enough to start sharing, a lot of them feel like they have to apologize for being born with a penis. Like a lot of the boys feel like as soon like I need
Why
to
is that?
because like they're hearing so often. You hear about toxic masculinity, you hear about the patriarchy, and the boys are there's been schools where boys have had to stand up, like third, fourth, fifth grade boys have had to stand up and apologize to the girls for all of the harm that men have done women over the course of history. And so there's this thing where boys are feeling like I should feel bad that I'm born a
It's a
young
lot
man.
of responsibility.
It's 100%, right? And
Yeah.
I'm like, that stuff drives me absolutely crazy. Do I think that there are like toxic people in the world? 100%, but that doesn't mean that like boys in sixth grade shouldn't be talking about toxic masculinity. It drives me crazy. So what I do is I'm like, there are 100% toxic male ideologies, but let's talk about the positive things around masculinity. And I think once they feel it's safe to, and I'm not saying go all the way in the other direction where, and there's this pendulum that swings back and forth, right? It's like, there one from my father's generation to was like, kids are better seen and not heard. And, get me my beer and my dinner, bitch. And like, I'm going to come home and have my scotch and then I'm going to go out with the boys. And I don't ever want to see you and, smack you around if you speak up. To where the pendulum swung to where like men feel that they're afraid to be men, and they tuck their penis between their legs and they're like following their woman around like, what can I do can I brush her hair and carry my dog with a purple sweater in your purse? Like, we don't want that either. Like, but where can we be in a spot where we can be strong and secure with who we are, but also be vulnerable? Like, recognize like I'm going through something really challenging right now. I might need some help. Let me get on the phone with my buddy Mike and like, Mike, there's something that's come up right now that I'm really struggling with. Can you help me through this? Yeah. That's not like being a wimp or a wuss. Like, that's being strong to be able to ask for help in that situation.
I think if anything, Dennis, that makes you more of a man, is being able to acknowledge that I need help and I have men that I could call. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got just from men and their problems, and I've seen this a lot in just relationships, and then we'll kind of wrap up the episode here today, is that, one of the best pieces of advice is that you can't rely on your partner to solve problems for you. And men have problems that other men can help them troubleshoot, and women have problems that they can go to other women for. And you guys should not be relying on each other to solve each other's problems when it comes to men's specific problems or women's specific problems. And I found that so freeing for myself to be able to call up my buddies and go, hey man, I'm dealing with something right now. And, you're a guy that I admire. You're a guy I know that knows a lot about this. Like, how would you suggest that I troubleshoot or navigate this? I think there's a lot of power in that, especially for men to be able to have that type of self-awareness, and also the humility that comes with saying like, hey, you know what? This is me. This is actually me being part of being a man, is actually asking for help.
Love
with that. Yeah. Well, Dennis, again, man, thank you so much for joining the show today. It's good to see you. I mean, I know it's been a couple of years. I'm glad we got to catch up.
Yeah. I'd love to have you back on the Building Men podcast.
Oh man, I would love that. It was a
blast, man. Let's do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That would be great. Well, I got you on tape now. So you have to, on the record. But we end every episode with asking our guests, what it means to live your truth. So Dennis, for you, what does it mean to you to live your truth?
When I ran Building Men in person, I would give the boys this poem. The poem was called "The Man in the Glass," and it was something that I asked them to memorize. And it's a 5-stanza poem. The author of the poem, I believe, is an unknown author. But I would have banners of this printed up, and it was really impactful for them to, like, as far as authenticity is concerned, and it aligns well with living your truth. I'm not going to recite the whole thing, but the last stanza, even, it's something I've memorized, but the last stanza of the poem is, you may fool the whole world down the pathway of years and get pats on the back as you pass, but your final reward will be heartache and tears if you've cheated the man in the glass. And talking to boys about this idea of like going and like the actual process of going and looking at yourself in the mirror and like, what do you see? Who are you? And like, are you truly living up to the ideals that you believe that you can live up to? And it's a really powerful thing. So that's like, that poem embodies everything about living your truth and like truly embodying what does it mean to be a man for you? And then what can you do to lead other men along your journey as well?
Man, that's so good. I love that too. And I hope all of you out there, that are, if you're a man out there right now and you're struggling and you're looking for a place to navigate, or you have a son or you have a nephew, please reach out to Dennis. You could reach out to myself. We're more than happy to connect you to resources. There are a lot of men out there, Dennis, I'm sure you know, that are struggling with suicide and alcohol. And, it's something that's very alarming. And I know the work that you're doing is so important to reduce that rate and to really set up our next generation of boys to lead and to provide, and also just be their most authentic version of yourself. So thank you again, my friend. It's been so good to have you on the show.
My pleasure, dude. Thanks again.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for tuning into this week's episode of Live Your Truth Now. If you like what you heard, go ahead and give us a follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch this episode and other episodes on our YouTube channel. This is Michael Gorey, and I'll see you next week. Take care.